Hi all, let's look at the most important game Caruana has played so far in his life. He's playing to challenge Magnus Carlsen, especially if he wins. It'll be a guarantee he'll be playing Magnus Carlsen because he's half a point ahead of the rest of the field. This is his last round game in the World Championship candidates, playing black against Alexander Grischuk. Let's have a look. E4 from Alexander Grischuk. Caruana plays E5 and his trusty Petrov defense, and we have D4 here. More usual is knight takes e5, but we have d4, which is the second most popular move. Knight takes e4, we have d takes e5, which is again the second most popular move to bishop d3. So d takes e5, we have d5, knight bd2, knight takes d2, bishop takes, bishop e7, bishop d3, c5. It seems as though black's pretty comfortable so far. He hasn't got any bad bishop or anything. After bishop g4 now, a nice pin as well, and the bishop can also come back to challenge its counterpart to try and take away the sting of any potential attack. We have now queen d7, which puts the brakes on e6 in some lines, protecting against e6 break. h3, the bishop drops back. So for example here, queen's holding against e6. We have bishop f4. Now the curious move, queen e6. I'm trying to work out why queen e6 instead of castling, and this is my conclusion that I'm going to present you, why queen e6 played. I think it comes down to the fact that if castling, this queen is actually a loose piece, and that is actually important because of queen c2 potentially hitting h7, because if bishop takes f3, bishop takes h7 check, and we have bishop f5, and then later g takes, and white will be better there. In the game continuation, this is kind of ruled out because black plays queen e6, a little finesse. The queen's protected by the pawn on f7. Now white plays a3. Black now castles, not fearing queen c2 here. White plays b4 in fact. Queen c2 here, bishop takes f3 is better than before because now bishop f5. Can you see what black can do here? Celebrating that the queen's protected by the f7 pawn. Black to play. What would you play in this position? Okay, bishop e4 is possible. Because if queen takes e4, d takes, we can always recapture this one. So it's going to be fine for black. More than fine for black there. So the queen being protected on e6, yeah, just to show you again the finesse here. In that line, if we look at it with the queen on d7, there's a slight difference here. Because bishop e4, can you see what white plays in this position? With the queen not being protected on d7, white can play, if I give you 5 seconds. Okay, queen takes e4. Yeah, and then white will be better here. So a little finesse, queen e6. So sometimes these super GMs do just change the protected status of one of their pieces. Maybe one or more of their pieces, if that's possible. But yeah, definitely one of the pieces. Here, the queen is now protected by the pawn on f7. Okay, a3, and now castling. So without worrying about queen c2 so much. White plays b4, which is, it seems a little bit double-edged actually, because this pawn is able to be undermined later with a5. It's trying to break those dark squares to create some sort of dark square blockade. But it looks as though black, for the moment, plays h6. And now white is also making this bishop protected, because sometimes there's going to be a tactic involving knight d4, which hits the bishop and queen. But this bishop being protected or not makes a difference, because here bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, hitting the bishop. So black would be like winning a piece. It's quite amusing that just these moves, which are subtle, they change the status of pieces being protected or not. So we see bishop g3. I think we're taught generally not to have pieces that are unprotected in principle. And here, yeah, the super GMs are playing moves simply to have pieces looking out for each other's back. Okay, too much. I've been watching Suits too much. Okay, it's this Netflix series. Check it out. So bishop g3. So the pawn, the bishop's out of the firing line. It's protected there, it's safe, and there might be the potential for knight d4 coming up. We have b6, and it's here, this knight d4, so even though that's only relatively pinned, it can hit the queen. Now this transition after the queen's come off is interesting. It seems as though black's more than okay here after c4, bishop c2. There's a couple of things about this. This pawn chain is subject to undermining with a5, and the other thing is, if we have only 2 pawns there, then d4 will create a strong pass pawn. So it seems there's a lot of strategic break potential for black, with a5 for undermining and d4 later for further undermining to create a potentially dangerous pass pawn. This bishop's hemmed in by its own pawn on e5. Although this is an advanced pawn, you might think that's advantageous. Sometimes that can be a target in its own right. Okay, let's see what happens. b5, and now there is a really strong threat of a5. White really has to do something about a5. Just to give you a feel for the power of a5 here, if bishop h2, a5, and then a takes, taking here, rook c8 with the potential for d4. This is massive here. This is absolutely massive for black. d4, black has a big advantage here, ripping through the center, creating a pass pawn, maybe even using a big d5 square, but these pawns would be menacing. So this is a really dangerous situation here after b5, fixing down the b4 pawn for a5. We've seen that in other games. They first fix down pawns, because later there's going to be big scrutiny, undermining with a5 here. White tries against that with a4. This move designed against a5 in advance, hitting b5. So now we have a6 protecting the b5 pawn, f3, and in fact the pawns are so dangerous here in this position. It seems as though, white's trying to blockade on the dark squares. It seems as though almost this is actually possible. A knight sack for 2 pawns, because we get 2 connected pass pawns hitting the rook here. This position is actually technically black's doing very well here. For example, if white plays inaccurately, black's got a big advantage already. This is really dangerous, this knight takes b4, really dangerous. But white plays maybe a little bit safer, maybe doesn't really trust that too much, giving up a piece for just a couple of pawns there. Plays bishop g5. We have here bishop f2, bishop f4 hitting e5, bishop c5 hitting the rook moves, bishop d6 protecting the e5 pawn, bishop g3, rook e2, g5 fixing down white's pawns a bit, giving the g7 square for the king. Now with these pawns fixed, there's a route on dark squares in endgames sometimes for the kings when pawns are fixed down like this. King f1, king f7, bishop c7, the rook moves, bishop d6, this rook moves now, and there's a potential for d4 here if the bishop wasn't nannying b4. Rook a1, as though a takes and an infiltration is likely, but black doesn't care about that. Rook e d8, it's not a big deal here. Bishop b1, rook d7, rook a3. If we look at this taking here, let's look at this as an example. Here, h5, this should be fine. This should be fine even here. There's no major problem with that infiltration on the a file at the moment. So yeah, rook a3. We have now here after rook a3, it might have been better to play ab. We have now d4. This is breaking out a protected pass pawn, basically. The c4 pawn is a protected pass pawn. Not only that, this bishop could help it sort of land on the c8 square, because that bishop's got access to c1. A takes, c takes, protected pass pawn time. Black's in the driving seat here. Rook e2, knight drops back. Bishop e4. Now we have an exchange of pawns basically after bishop takes e5, because white now plays this, taking the piece back. Black takes the piece back, white takes his pawn back. But we're left now, let's opposite colour bishops. Black's still in the driving seat here. After check, you can see that black's got all the pressure. He's got the protected pass pawn a bit further than white's pass pawn. Also, the dark squares are pretty weak, and it's black's king which is more likely to glide along the dark squares here in this scenario. King e3, rook b1, hitting b4, check, king f6, bishop d7, check, and now rook d8, rook c2. Here, if the rook plunges in to hit e6. There's some tricks here. Check, and then there's a trick here. Black to play. What would you play in this position? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Rook takes d7. Big exchange sack for this pass pawn to start running down the board. Black would be winning this scenario. Big advantage there. So that infiltration is no good. So we have rook c2, but passive looking. Rook takes b4, getting rid of white's potentially dangerous pass pawn. So it's yeah, it's looking like a torture rack here now for white. Pawn down. He's only trying to hold now. Black can play on with little risk, even though he only needs probably a draw because the other results are coming in. And at this point, I think he only needed perhaps a draw. And I think a draw was given by Grischuk at some point around here, but it was declined. So rook d7 was played. If rook takes c3, it's the white king that really is in trouble off the check, just mating. So that pawn is immune there. The bishop and rook are coordinating well on d2. So rook d7, rook c8, hitting the bishop. Bishop tries to blockade. h5. Fixing down these pawns will mean the king can glide down to g3 later without a concern. It's like creating a road down on dark squares. King d3, rook b2, there's a blockade on c2, h4, so the king can later glide to g3. The road's being built. Rook d1, king e5, the king's coming in. Rook a1, rook d8, rook d1, rook db8, rook a1, bishop d2, rook a6, rook d8, rook c6, rook b1, king f2, rook a1, rook c4, some shuffling around, rook d4, rook c8, rook b4. Black's going to be trying to challenge the blockade now of his passed pawn. King f4, the king simultaneously coming in on the dark squares. King f2, rook bb1, threatening almost a mating net, almost. So rook f8 check, king e5, bishop d3, rook b2 challenging the blockader, king e2 check, and now wrenching out that blockade. So an exchange of rooks is now on the cards. Rook takes, c takes. To win endgame, sometimes you need two issues of the opponent. Here there's two issues. Potentially the king can infiltrate to g3, and also we've got this big passed pawn. So they're on both sides of the board. So basically white is getting a bit overloaded here on both sides of the board. He's holding for the moment against the passed pawn, but okay, bishop e4, bishop d4 check. He can't now defend against this infiltration as well. King f4, the road which was built earlier, the king's travelling across the dark squares. Rook b4, e5, rook b7, king g3, and the game actually ended here. This is a total overload for the white position. Even though it's opposite coloured bishops, it's totally overloaded. I'll give you an example. Rook g7, we just take here, and then we're taking h3, and that's going to be too much. And there's also this b1 to consider. And if f4, okay, you might think opposite coloured bishops do something here. It doesn't really. In fact, king takes f4, hitting the bishop might be strongest instead of taking with a pawn to hit the bishop. And then to play this with the one threat includes e4 and rook e1, sort of weaving a mating net, potentially, sorry. Yeah, because of king f2, e3. I'll show you this scenario. Let's say white does nothing, e4. And I'll show you a scenario white does nothing, he just ends up getting mated like this. Okay, let's say white tries to play a bit more sensibly with check, then just king g2. And yeah, it's an overload, g2 and b1 friends. So this pawn's dropping, and then this pawn's dropping, all the pawns are dropping. So let's take it where the game ended, and we have a new challenger for the great Magnus Carlsen. So the game ended here after king g3. So really fascinating games in this candidates tournament. It's been a real fighting tournament, really exciting stuff. Very interesting opening innovations. I hope you've enjoyed my technical coverage of this event, more technical coverage. And there are one or two games actually we haven't covered yet which were decisive, which maybe check out tomorrow or after tomorrow as well. But I hope you've enjoyed this stuff, and congratulations, fabulous game from Fabiano. So congratulations, the challenger to Magnus Carlsen now for the next World Chess Championship. Comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks very much.